The wind always seemed to blow a little colder for Annie Dawson, though no one in the small frontier town of Red Creek could quite explain why. She was a slight, soft-spoken girl of 8, with eyes too wise for her years and hands that always fidgeted with a wooden cross hanging from a frayed string around her neck. Some people said she held on to it because it was all she had left from her mama. Others said she held it because she still believed in miracles. Either way, that little cross was her anchor in a world that had often felt unkind. Annie had been an orphan for nearly 2 years. A fever took her mother, and her father had passed even earlier, leaving her with no living relatives, at least none who wanted to claim her. The town tried its best. A widow let her sleep for a few nights on a cot near the hearth. A baker left rolls on the back step by accident, and the schoolteacher kept a blanket for her in the corner of the one-room schoolhouse. But no single household was willing to take her in permanently. Folks on the frontier already lived hard lives. With mouths to feed and work that never ended, most felt too stretched to add another child, especially one carrying sorrow as deep as Annie's. Still, Annie never begged. She never complained. Instead, she carried herself with a small, brave dignity. She swept porches, fetched water, and gathered eggs for those who offered her a warm meal in return. And every night, before she slept, sometimes on a borrowed blanket in a barn loft, sometimes on a straw mat in the schoolhouse, she would kneel beside her small pile of belongings. She'd clasp her hands together tightly, eyes closed, lips moving in a whisper only God and the walls could hear. "Please," she prayed, "please send me a family. Someone who wants me. Someone who will keep me." It was the same prayer she had spoken every night since she lost her mother. Some nights she prayed with hope. Other nights she prayed through tears. But she never stopped. She truly believed that God heard her, even if the answer had not yet come. Despite her loneliness, Annie had a gentle nature that drew both children and adults to her. She helped the younger school children tie their boots, shared her small portion of lunch with anyone who forgot theirs, and was always the first to comfort a crying child. But kindness was not the same as belonging. When families walked home together after Sunday church, Annie walked alone, her steps slow and small. When Christmas came, she received simple gifts from townsfolk: mittens, a knitted scarf, a book with half its pages already worn, but still she went to bed without, the warmth of a mother's embrace or a father's steady voice telling her she was loved. The town's pastor, Reverend Turner, worried for her. He often invited Annie to sweep the church or help polish the pews, using the time to speak gently to her. "You're strong, Annie," he said once as she scrubbed a lantern until it shone. Some prayers take time because God's preparing something special. Annie nodded, but her voice was small when she answered, I just don't want to be alone forever." Red Creek was a place of dust and wind, of mountains that cast long shadows at dusk, of people hardened by life but softened by neighborly duty. Yet somehow, in all its rough edges and wide-open spaces, there had not yet been a place where Annie fit. But the frontier had a way of shifting like weather, like seasons, like the unexpected arrival of a rider coming down the road. Annie didn't know it yet, but her prayer was already on its way, carried by dust, horse hooves, and the quiet heart of a cowboy who had no idea he was about to find the family he didn't know he needed. Caleb Ward was the kind of man people noticed long before he spoke. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dust-stained boots and a face worn by sun and sorrow, he carried an air of quiet strength, yet also a heaviness that clung to him like the trail dust on his coat. No one in Red Creek had seen him in nearly 3 years. Not since he packed up his belongings and rode off after losing the one person who meant the world to him, his wife. Ella had been bright as spring sunshine, quick to laugh, gentle in spirit, and endlessly patient with Caleb's rough edges. They had dreamed of building a ranch together, a place where children could run barefoot, through the grass and where laughter would replace the silence Caleb had grown used to as a boy. But life, especially frontier life, had a way of taking more than it gave. A sudden illness swept through their homestead before help could reach them. Caleb buried Ella beneath the cottonwood tree she loved, carved her name into a wooden cross, and rode away from the ranch they'd planned to grow old on. He never spoke much after that. Over the years, Caleb drifted from town to town, doing whatever work needed doing. Brand cattle, break horses, guard stagecoaches, help settle disputes. Folks said he was reliable, strong, honorable. But they also said he was distant like a man half alive, living only for the work in front of him. He slept under the stars more often than under a roof, cooked his meals over the coals of small campfires, and rarely stayed anywhere long enough to form a tie. The only person who could still reach him was his mother, Margaret Ward, an aging woman whose health had begun to decline. When Caleb received word that she'd taken a fall and needed help, he rode back to Red Creek without hesitation. Family was something he understood. Something he would not fail again. The town of Red Creek hadn't changed much since he left. Wooden storefronts leaned with age, the saloon door still hung crooked, and the dusty road carried the same wind that used to ruffle Ella's hair when she walked beside him. The mountains still rose tall in the distance, watching over the town like ancient guardians. For Caleb, returning felt like stepping into a life he wasn't sure he had the strength to face. His mother greeted him with a smile that masked her pain. Though older and frailer than he remembered, she still had that stubborn spark in her eye. "I knew you'd come," she said, gripping his calloused hand with her thin fingers. "You always come when it matters." Caleb stayed at her small cabin on the edge of town, doing the chores she couldn't manage, chopping firewood, tending the chickens, repairing the roof. But even as he worked, he remained closed off, speaking little, keeping his grief tucked deep inside. The people of Red Creek welcomed him back with polite nods and cautious glances. They respected him, but they didn't know him. Caleb didn't mind. Solitude felt safer. Feelings only hurt, but Red Creek had a way of weaving people together, especially those who were hurting. Caleb didn't know it yet, but the town had a small, quiet soul wandering its streets, a little girl with a wooden cross around her neck and a prayer in her heart. And soon, inevitably, their paths would cross. It would happen in the simplest way, as most life-changing moments do. A dropped basket, a gentle smile, a fragile voice saying, "Thank you, sir." And without warning, something inside Caleb, something tightly locked away, would begin to stir, not because he was ready, but because love, especially the unexpected kind, often arrives before a man knows he needs it. The moment that would quietly redraw the lines of Caleb's life began on an ordinary afternoon, beneath an early spring sun that warmed the dusty streets of Red Creek. Caleb had been helping his mother, outside her small cabin, repairing the fence that had sagged through the winter. Margaret Ward, though frailer than in years past, insisted on sweeping the porch despite Caleb's constant reminders to rest. "Idle hands make an idle mind," she'd said with a stubborn tilt of her chin. One Caleb recognized in himself, but her strength wasn't what it used to be. Halfway through her sweeping, her breath grew thin and she gripped the edge of the railing for balance. Before Caleb could reach her, a small voice broke through the quiet. "I can help, ma'am, if you'd like." He turned to see a little girl, thin, barefoot, with a worn dress and a shawl too big for her narrow shoulders. Her hair was neatly braided, though loose strands curled around her face, and she held a small basket of wildflowers, as if she'd planned to deliver them to someone and lost her courage halfway. Margaret's expression softened immediately. "Annie, dear," she said with a warm smile, "I'd be grateful for the help." Caleb had seen the girl around town in passing, but had never paid much mind. Now up close, he noticed how she kept her gaze lowered. Her hands clasped tightly around the handle of the basket, as if she feared taking up too much space without being asked. Annie stepped forward and gently took the broom from Margaret's trembling hands. She swept with careful, deliberate strokes, as though the task were something sacred. Caleb watched her with a quiet curiosity. There was something about the girl, something fragile yet steady, that tugged at a part of him he'd long kept buried. When she finished, Margaret invited her to stay for tea. "Oh, I can't impose," Annie said quickly, shaking her head. "I was just passing by." "Nonsense," Margaret replied. "You've helped me, and that makes you a guest." Caleb expected the girl to refuse, to flee before she troubled anyone, but the kindness in his mother's voice seemed to loosen Annie's hesitation. She sat on the porch steps, small hands wrapped around the warm mug Caleb poured for her. She blew on the steam, eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "Sir." Caleb hadn't been called that by anyone small and earnest in a long time. The simple words struck him deeper than he cared to admit. As they talked, Caleb learned that Annie helped several folks around town, doing small chores in exchange for meals. Never asking, never demanding, just giving what she could. Margaret listened to the girl with an affection that made Caleb uneasy, not because he disliked it, but because it reminded him of feelings he thought he'd forgotten. "You're welcome here any time." "Annie," Margaret said as the girl prepared to leave. "I mean that." Annie paused on the steps, that wooden cross around her neck catching the sunlight. "Thank you," she said again, voice trembling with sincerity. "You're home. It feels nice." When she walked away, Caleb noticed she kept glancing back, almost as though she feared the sight of warmth would vanish if she blinked. That evening, as Caleb helped his mother settle into bed, she looked up at him with knowing eyes. "She's a good child," Margaret said. "A lonely one." Caleb grunted in agreement, trying to remain detached. But his mother didn't miss the small flicker in his eyes. "She needs someone," she added softly. "And I think, perhaps, you do too." Caleb didn't answer. He simply stepped outside, leaning against the porch rail as the sky dimmed into indigo. He wasn't ready to open his heart, not again. Not so soon after learning to live with the emptiness Ella left behind. But as he watched the path Annie had walked, the soft prints of her bare feet fading in the evening dust, he felt something shift inside him. A stirring. A quiet ache. A question he didn't yet dare speak aloud, because something in that small girl's presence had cracked open a door he'd kept locked for years, and something in her eyes so full of longing, yet still hopeful, made him wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, God was weaving their stories together long before either of them realized it. Spring in Red Creek had always been unpredictable warm sunshine one week, biting frost the next. But that year, the weather seemed determined to test the town's endurance. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains, heavy and low, turning the air sharp with the promise of a storm. Unlike any the settlement had seen in years, Caleb sensed it in his bones the moment the first gust of icy wind swept across the valley. He was hauling firewood to his mother's cabin when the sky cracked open with distant thunder. The chickens clucked anxiously. Even his horse, Duke, pawed restlessly at the ground. "This storm's got teeth," Caleb muttered. Over the next few hours, the wind howled through the town, rattling windows and driving people indoors. Snow fell thick and fast, too fast for early spring, and the temperature dropped with alarming speed. Red Creek was not prepared. Wagons overturned. A few families found themselves stranded on the outskirts of town, cut off by drifts rising higher than a man's waist. Caleb didn't hesitate. As soon as he learned that 2 families had been caught while returning from a supply trip, he saddled Duke and joined the rescue party. The storm swallowed them almost immediately, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Icy needles stung Caleb's skin. The wind howled like a living thing. But he pressed on, guided by instinct and determination. Back in town, Annie huddled inside Margaret Ward's cabin beside the fire, clutching her wooden cross tightly. She had come earlier that afternoon to help Margaret bring in laundry before the storm hit. But once the blizzard arrived, there was no safe way for her to return to the schoolhouse where she often slept. The cabin shook with every blast of wind. The fire crackled loudly, fighting against the cold that seeped through the walls. "Is Caleb gonna be okay?" Annie whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "My son is strong and stubborn. He'll come back." But Annie could see the worry in the older woman's eyes, the way they drifted to the frosted window, searching for a shadow that wasn't there. Hours passed. The storm raged on without mercy. When Caleb finally returned, nearly frozen, his coat thick with snow, Annie ran to him without thinking. She threw her arms around him, small and trembling. And for the first time in years, Caleb let someone cling to him. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close as he staggered inside. "We got Em," he said, voice hoarse. "Everyone's safe." Annie didn't let go. Not for a long while. That moment, the warmth of her tiny hands gripping his coat. The tears she didn't bother to hide stirred something in Caleb he had tried to bury. A fierce protectiveness. A longing he didn't fully understand, but storms weren't the only trials waiting on the horizon. 2 days later, when the snow began to melt and the town slowly returned to life, a stranger arrived. A man claiming to be a distant relative of Annie's mother. He had heard, he said, that the girl was alone and could be useful around his homestead. The word useful made Caleb's jaw clench with anger. The man's eyes were cold, calculating. It was clear he wasn't seeking family, he was seeking labor. And Annie, hearing his claim, grew pale with dread. She clutched her cross so tightly it left an imprint in her palm. Caleb's mother pulled him aside after the man left. "You saw her eyes," Margaret said, voice trembling with emotion. "That child is terrified. And she has reason to be." Caleb stared at the ground, wrestling with the truth he could no longer deny. Annie wasn't just a girl who wandered into their lives. She mattered to his mother, to the town, and to him. But if Caleb wanted to protect her, he would have to fight not just against a legal claim, but against the walls around his own wounded heart, because love and responsibility were coming for him, faster than any storm. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in Red Creek, not just in the drifts of stubborn snow that clung to the shaded corners of town, but in the hearts of the people who'd weathered it together. And for Caleb Ward, the days following the blizzard settled over him like a quiet revelation. When he tried and failed to shake, Annie stayed close after the storm. Not out of fear or habit, but because the Ward home had become the one place she felt safe. She helped Margaret mend torn clothing, fed the chickens, and sat by the fire in the evenings, listening as Margaret shared stories from Caleb's childhood. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye more often than he meant to notice how she jumped up eagerly to help, how she tried not to take more food than she thought she deserved, how she tucked her wooden cross inside her dress whenever she was nervous. He noticed, too, how his mother's eyes lit up whenever Annie entered the room. But peace is a fragile thing. And the man who claimed to be Annie's distant relative, Mr. Harlan, returned to town with paperwork he'd hastily assembled. A letter from some cousin twice removed, a vague mention of family connection, and an insistence that it was his duty to take Annie in. Caleb didn't believe a word of it, and neither did anyone else. The townspeople had begun to see Annie as more than the quiet little girl wandering from doorstep to doorstep. The storm had shown them how deeply she'd become woven into their lives. And when Harlan came asking questions, harsh ones, the kind that made Annie's eyes fill with fear, they collectively stiffened. Caleb's mother was the first to speak out. "You will not take that child anywhere," Margaret said, standing with surprising strength despite her frail frame. "Not while I'm still breathing." Harlan sneered, but Margaret wasn't done. "And Caleb won't allow it either." Caleb stiffened. All eyes turned to him. He hadn't spoken his heart aloud, not to his mother, not to himself, not even in prayer. But now the moment stood before him, demanding an answer. Harlan left with a threat to return, promising to bring the sheriff with him next time. Annie retreated into the corner of the cabin, clutching her cross tightly, her face pale. Caleb's mother sat beside her, stroking her hair, whispering gentle reassurances, but it was Caleb who knelt down in front of Annie, the fire crackling softly behind him. "Annie," he said quietly, Do you want to go with that man?" Her head snapped up, panic flooding her eyes. "No, please, no. He doesn't want me, not really. He just wants someone to work. I don't want to go. I want to stay here." She swallowed hard. "If I'm allowed." Caleb felt a shift inside him, a click, a settling, as though something long displaced had found its rightful place at last. "You don't need permission to want a home," he said, gently. "But I need someone to choose me," she whispered. Those words hit Caleb like a hammer. He had once lost the person he chose, Ella, and spent years shutting the world out, believing love was a risk too dangerous to touch. But now, kneeling in front of this trembling girl, he understood something he'd forgotten. Love wasn't just something you received. It was something you gave. Later that evening, after Annie had fallen asleep curled in a blanket by the fire, Margaret took Caleb's hand. "You've already chosen her," she said softly. "You just haven't said it yet." Caleb stood there a long moment, staring at the small form sleeping near the hearth. He remembered how she'd run into his arms when he returned from the storm. The way she looked at him with trust she couldn't hide. The prayers she whispered when she thought no one heard. "She needs a father," Margaret whispered. Caleb swallowed. "I don't know how to be one." His mother squeezed his hand. "Then start by being the man who shows up." The next morning, when Harlan returned with bluster and false claims, he found not a frightened girl, but a united town. A pastor, the school teacher, the families whose porches Annie had swept. And at their center, Caleb Ward stood firm as stone. "No one's taking her," Caleb said, his voice unwavering. "I'm filing to adopt her." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, not shock, but relief, hope, approval. Harlan sputtered, argued, blustered, but he was outnumbered, outmatched, and out of place. Eventually, he stormed off, defeated. Caleb watched him go, feeling a strange, fierce peace settle over him, because for the first time in years, he wasn't running from pain. He was running towards something worth fighting for, and Annie Small, trembling, hopeful Annie, had heard every word. She raced to him, arms flinging around his waist. "You want me?" she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Caleb hugged her tightly, his voice rough with emotion. "I choose you, Annie, if you'll have me." And in that moment, standing in the sunlight with the entire town witnessing it, Annie knew her prayer had finally been answered. Spring slowly returned to Red Creek, melting the last of winter's snow and softening the world with new warmth. Buds appeared on the cottonwoods, wildflowers pushed through the damp earth, and life in the little frontier town found its rhythm again. But for Annie, Caleb, and Margaret Ward, the rhythm had changed into something steadier, warmer, and filled with a hope none of them had dared to imagine. The decision Caleb made to adopt Annie set the whole town in motion. The pastor helped gather the necessary documents. The school teacher wrote a glowing testimony about Annie's kindness and diligence. Families she had helped offered statements of support. Even the sheriff, after pulling Caleb aside to ask if he was sure he was ready for such responsibility, ended up signing a letter vouching for his character. It was as though the entire town had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to step forward and give Annie the home she deserved. As for Annie, she followed Caleb like a shadow those days, not out of fear, but out of a pure, incredulous sense of belonging. She helped him mend fences, brushed down his horse, and asked shy questions about ranch life as though imagining the possibilities. Sometimes she would quietly slip her small hand into his as they walked to town. Testing the safety of the gesture, Caleb never pulled away. Still, Annie worried. Her prayers at night, whispered softly under her breath, held a mixture of gratitude and fear. Please don't let him change his mind. Please let me stay. The wooden cross she carried felt different now, not a last hope, but a reminder of the miracle unfolding around her. Then came the day the adoption papers arrived. Caleb spread them on the kitchen table, smoothing out the creases. His mother stood beside him, eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. Annie sat quietly on a stool, swinging her feet nervously as she watched Caleb pick up the pen. He looked at her with serious, steady eyes. Annie, once I sign this, everything changes. But I want to hear you say it, clear as day. Do you want this? Annie swallowed hard. More than anything, she whispered. I've prayed for a family every night, and I prayed God would send me someone who wouldn't let me go. Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the pen. Then that's exactly what I'll be. With deliberate strokes, he signed his name, Caleb Ward, in strong, confident letters. Margaret let out a quiet, joyful sob. Annie pressed her hands to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. It was done. Legally, officially, and undeniably done. Caleb stood and knelt before her, just as he had on the day he promised to choose her. Annie Ward, he said softly, you're my daughter now. She lunged forward, tears spilling freely, and threw her arms around him. Caleb closed his eyes as he held her deeply, protectively, with a tenderness he hadn't thought he was capable of anymore. Something inside him healed in that embrace, knitting together wounds that had ached for years. Margaret wiped her cheeks and murmured, God answers in his own time, doesn't he? And he had. Life changed quickly after that. Annie's laughter filled the cabin, chasing away the silence that had once haunted its rooms. She helped Margaret with cooking, learned to care for Duke, and rode out with Caleb across the ranch, her braids flying behind her in the wind. Every day, she grew a little braver, a little more certain this new life was hers to keep. Caleb found himself smiling more real, unguarded smiles. He spoke more, too, sharing bits of his past, stories of Ella, memories he once kept locked tight. And Annie listened with such compassion that his grief, instead of drowning him, finally softened into something bearable. On warm evenings, the three of them would sit on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. Annie would lean her head on Caleb's shoulder, Margaret would hold her hand. And the world felt whole. No longer a girl alone. No longer a cowboy wandering. No longer a mother waiting for her son to come home. They were a family stitched together by love, sealed by courage, and held by faith stronger than the hardest winter. And each night, before Annie fell asleep in her very own bed, she whispered the same prayer. Thank you for answering me, and for giving me a cowboy's love. But now, her prayers were not desperate. They were full of joy, because she was home.